Welcome to another episode of Mike's Money Picks. Today on the podcast, we're going to be breaking down the Wednesday, March 6th slate of college basketball DFS. We have got an exciting 10-game slate on DraftKings, as well as I'm sure there's going to be a slate coming on FanDuel. I do not see one yet at the time of recording, but I'm sure there's going to be one. I'm sure it's going to feature similar games to the DraftKings slate. Remember, we do support FanDuel college basketball around here. Some of their pricing sometimes is easier to build lineups, and them being healthy competition in DraftKings is going to help DraftKings create a better product as well. So I do support both sides. Anyway, we've got a 10-game slate on DraftKings, and so we are going to break down all 10 games on this episode and tell you what you can expect from each game, as well as who you need to target for your DFS lineups from each game. We've got the full gamut of games here on this Wednesday slate. We've got some games with some really high totals and some really low totals. We've got some games with major NCAA tournament implications and two teams that are just trying to finish up the season. So there's really just a wide variety of game environments you can expect here on this Wednesday, and being able to pick and choose who you want and find the value where you want on this Wednesday night slate is going to be important as you build your lineups, and we're going to break it all down here for you. Now, this is March, y'all. So make sure you are subscribed to the YouTube channel, subscribe to the audio feed if you listen on audio as well, because we are going to be bringing you college basketball content all month long. And if you're subscribed, you'll be notified when new episodes drop, and you will not miss one, because we're going to be talking DFS. We're going to be doing bracket predictions. We're going to have a whole bunch of stuff with college basketball, including some live shows. So make sure you're subscribed so that way you can know when those go on, and you'll be with us for the entire month of March as we finish up this exciting college basketball season. All right, now also, if you like what we do here at the channel, if you've seen these videos before, I don't generally like asking for these at the start of the video, but the numbers don't lie. I do get more likes on videos where I do mention this at the start, but if you like what we do here at the channel, please go ahead and hit that like button, and on YouTube, I promise those help me out a ton. It helps the videos get noticed, helps the channel get noticed, and it really does help, and I really do appreciate it. If you're listening on audio, go ahead and give me a rating and a review. I promise those help out a ton. It helps the podcast show up in searches. Right now, if you search college basketball DFS on Spotify, I am the first podcast that shows up, and that is partly because of you guys rating and reviewing, and I really do appreciate it. All right, so let's go ahead and dive into this 10-game slate, y'all. We don't have any more time to waste. All right, so the first game of the slate is going to be a battle in the Big East between Villanova and Seton Hall. And one thing I'm noticing that's a little weird, y'all, is how DraftKings, some days they include this 6:30 game, and it's always a Big East game because the TV contract they have at Fox, which is, in my opinion, genius of that conference to do. But in some slates, they don't. And so I don't particularly know why they felt the need to include this one, because this is one of the worst game environments of the slate. But I'm not complaining, because I generally like these games between the Big East teams, and it's usually what's on my TV from 6:30 to 7. So in this game, KenPom has this projected to be 67-66 in favor of Villanova for a 133-point total, which makes it one of the worst game environments on the slate to target for DFS. In the first meeting between these two teams this season, Villanova won 80-54 with 134 total points scored, and one of them scored 80. That game was not close. A lot of backups played a lot of the second half. Now, both these teams rank outside of the top 250 in the nation in tempo and the top 50 in the nation in defensive efficiency. So basically, you got two slow teams that play good defense, and their previous meeting was not a game that you wanted to target. This is just the recipe of a game where you can fade entirely and be totally okay. But we'll talk about it anyway. So if anybody's going to go off for Villanova, it's going to be their big fella, Eric Dixon. So he did lead the way in fantasy scoring for them in that first meeting. He had 28 fantasy points in 28 minutes. He normally plays more minutes than that. So if this game were a little bit closer, he definitely has a higher ceiling. And we have seen bigs thoroughly dominate Seton Hall this season. Going back to Oso Ighodaro, Supreme Cook, Donovan Clingan this past Sunday. Like, we've seen bigs have big-time performances. Abu Usman of Xavier, who we're going to mention later. There's just been all kinds of bigs who have had big performances against Seton Hall this year, and Eric Dixon could very well add himself to the list. Now, in that first game for Villanova, Mark Armstrong was the lead guard. He did lead them in usage and fantasy scoring with 24 fantasy points in 26 minutes. But the problem is right now for Villanova is, like, their entire core of guards is healthy and playing minutes and taking shots. And so you've got Moore, Bamba, Armstrong, Hart, and Longino, and Hausen. That's 6 guys who are going to play like 3 spots on the floor. And so it's just not an easy situation to target, because you never know who's going to get the minutes or who's going to get the shots. And you just don't really know how it's going to go. And add that to the fact that it's not a great game environment. I can just pass on this entire guard rotation for Villanova and be totally okay. Now for Seton Hall. in that first game, when you talk about Seton Hall, you got to talk about Kadari Richmond, and he only played 25 minutes, only put up 21 fantasy points in that game because it was so lopsided. They really decided to conserve his minutes, and in that game, he had a 41% usage rate. So when he was out there, he did have the ball in his hands. He was doing a lot with it. He just didn't play enough minutes or was not effective enough with that usage to put up a solid fantasy total. What we're seeing recently, though, is he has not been great recently. He's been 34 fantasy points or lower in his last 3 games, but the usage has still been there. They've just been not the best game environments, right? Like, they lost by 21 points to Creighton and he didn't play a full minute load. Lost by 30 to UConn. They only put up 61 total points. So I definitely think this is a better spot for him than each of the last two, but I think there's much better options in DFS at a similar price. But you've probably heard me say this before. I'll say it again. Sometimes a bad play in DFS becomes a good play because if we get a low owned Kadari Richmond that everybody's staying away from, he still has a very high, very legitimately high ceiling in DFS. Now, Dre Davis is a guy we do have to mention. He has been insane lately for Seton Hall. He has scored 30 fantasy points or more in 4 straight games. His usage rate is going up, up, up. He's taken double-digit shots in all 4 of those games. So if the game environment were better, I'd feel a lot comfortable playing him, but he has shown the ability to hit value even in poor game environments. So he's a guy that definitely gets some consideration from me, especially considering that he has dual eligibility. Next up, game number 2 on the docket is LSU heading to Fayetteville to take on the Arkansas Razorbacks. Ken Pom has this one projected to be 78 to 77 in favor of Arkansas, which is a 155 point total, which is pretty healthy. The original meeting between these two teams was a 95 to 74 rout by the LSU Tigers. And on that LSU side in that game, they got a 4X game from Jordan Wright, Will Baker, and Jalen Cook. Jordan Wright is their big athletic physical guard who will fill it up in the scoring and rebounding and every now and then who'll get you some assists, blocks, and steals as well. He has not been great recently, but it's just because he hasn't been able to take as many shots. And in that original game against Arkansas, he was only 1 for 6 from the field, but that was all he needed to put up 31 fantasy points. So with the tempo that Arkansas plays at and the fact that he does have a really high ceiling, Jordan Wright is definitely going to make my player pool, and I'm not super duper concerned about what he has put up lately. Will Baker is a guy that you got to play, right? Like he's a GPP guy in DFS because he has a very high ceiling. He also has a very low floor, but he did hit that ceiling against Arkansas where he put up 33 fantasy points on 9 for 11 from the floor, and he was significantly lower in his rebounds and assist average than what he normally does for the season. So I definitely think that there's a recipe for a ceiling game here for Will Baker, and he's a guy that with the ceiling that he has at the price tag that he's at on DraftKings at $5,700, you definitely got to consider him for your lineups. Now, Jalen Cook was great in that game for LSU in the first meeting, but he's out. He is apparently suspended, which I don't know what he did to get suspended. They have not disclosed much about this situation at all, considering everybody thought he was hurt until like a day ago. But in his absence, Trey Hannibal has been pretty solid. Jalen Cook did play in that first game against Arkansas, and Trey Hannibal still put up 23.5 fantasy points. He has been operating as the starting point guard since Jalen Cook has been out. And in those 5 games, he is averaging 24 fantasy points in the games that Jalen Cook has missed. And that's a pretty solid number for a guy who's 6,700. His floor has been 18 fantasy points. So if Jalen Cook continues to be out, which he's going to be, Trey Hannibal is a guy that you can target with a very safe floor, but also a legitimate ceiling because he does have an opportunity to put up double-digit shots, and he does have a big-time pace-up spot against Arkansas. Speaking of Arkansas, I'm not even going to mention what they did in the first game against LSU because their rotation has just been a jumbled mess all season long. This team has been an absolute dumpster fire in the last 2 months, and there's just very little you can depend on from a week in, week out basis. What you can do is you can look at what they've done in like their most recent games and see if there's anything you can glean from it. But for the most part, you can't really look too far back in the season to see what they've been up to. Now, if you do look at the most recent games, it's been Khalif Battle ceiling games. And in the last 3 games, he's put up 50 fantasy points or more, which is just insane. And DraftKings gave him a big time price hike all the way up to $9,400. And I got to say, I don't think anybody's going to play him at that price tag. And I don't see a reason why he can't do that again. Like, just based off of name recognition, I don't think he deserves to be 9,400 priced up there with the likes of Kadari Richmond and Tower Kolek and guys like that. Like, I don't think he deserves that price tag, but what he's done lately has been pretty incredible. And so if you think he can continue that streak, like, there's nothing in the streak that says that he can't do it again. Like, he's had consistent usage, he's had consistent shots, he's getting peripheral stats as well. It's a good pace spot against LSU. I don't see why he can't continue it, but I don't necessarily think it's a likely outcome. I would rather play Tremont Mark, who's been the team's best player and leader in usage all season long. Even with the emergence from Khalif Battle, Tremont Mark has still been taking a ton of shots as well. He got off 20 shots against Kentucky en route to a 40 fantasy point performance. I would rather play Tremont Mark than Khalif Battle just objectively because of what they've done from the course of the whole season, but I'm not going to doubt Khalif Battle's ceiling, even there with the $9,400 price tag. Now, one thing Arkansas did do for us, which was kind, was they have shortened up their rotation quite a bit. They only played 8 guys in their last game, but even 3 of them, like only 3 of them were fantasy viable, and 2 of them were Battle and Mark. I am holding out hope for Trayvon Brazile, who is a very athletic big who was their starting center at the start of the season, and he just hasn't gotten back to a full minutes load since his injury. He's played 17 and 15 minutes in his last 2 games, and if he were to see 20-plus minutes against LSU, the recipe is there for a ceiling game. Jeremiah Davenport's the other guy I got to talk about because he played 25 minutes against Kentucky and put up 22 fantasy points, which is one of his highest performances of the season. And it was really kind of came out of nowhere. Like, he's played 24 and 25 minutes in the last 2 games. If this is going to be what Musselman continues to do with his guard rotation, $4,400 is a very reasonable price for Jeremiah Davenport. But ask everybody who played Ellis on Saturday if you can depend on Eric Musselman's rotation for his guards. Game number 3, we've got Tennessee heading to Columbia to take on South Carolina. KenPom has this one projected to be 72-67 in favor of the Vols. This is a rematch of a game that was 63-59 in favor of South Carolina back in Knoxville. And so you had 122 points scored in that game. It's pretty bad. It's not a recipe for fantasy goodness. However, Dalton Knecht doesn't need a high-scoring game to reach value in fantasy. In that game against South Carolina, he had 31 of Tennessee's 59 points, put up 44 fantasy points, was 11 for 24 from the field. That is a lot of shots. And so to me, he's a guy that you can play anytime, anywhere. And, I don't understand why Khalif Battle is priced higher than him. Now, he's another one of these guys that's at a high price tag that Khalif Battle is higher than. And I really like Dalton Knecht. Even though the game environment projects to be pretty poor, it makes it a more narrow pathway for his ceiling. But Dalton Knecht has shown that he doesn't need a wide pathway. He can hit his ceiling anytime, anywhere. Now, we like the rest of the Tennessee guys in pace-up spots. We don't like the rest of the Tennessee guys in game environments like this because if Dalton Knecht is taking all those shots and scoring all those points, that means there's just less to go around for the rest of these Tennessee guys, right? Jonas Adu is a little bit intriguing to me. He got in foul trouble in that game against South Carolina and put up 16 fantasy points in 21 minutes. That's not a poor fantasy point per minute rate, but there's no guarantee that he's going to stay out of foul trouble and be able to do it again. And at that price tag, that's a pretty lofty goal. Josiah Jordan-James has been great recently. He's something to watch out for and monitor as we continue and finish up this season. But I don't have any faith of him to do it against South Carolina when the game is going to be this low scoring. Santiago Vescovi was the other guy who scored in double digits for Tennessee in that game against South Carolina, played 26 minutes, put up 10 real points, 19 fantasy points. He would be an option for me if you think that the game environment is going to be pretty similar to last time. Now, if it is similar to the last time, South Carolina pretty much played their entire offense through BJ Mack. Now, you would think that that would translate into a lot of fantasy points, right? Not really, because Tennessee plays really tough defense. Tennessee only surrendered him 23 fantasy points, and he played that game with a 41% usage rate. So, the matchup might be there for BJ Mack, but he's going to have to play more minutes if we want him to hit value, and that's just not something he does all the time. Taylon Cooper did have a really solid performance in that game against Tennessee. He did lead them in scoring, 28 fantasy points in that game, and this is a guy who generally is more rebound and assist dependent for fantasy scoring, so the fact that he scored in that game is definitely a good sign. After that, Colin Murray-Boyles has been pretty incredible for them recently, but against Tennessee, it's really hard to get excited. In that original game, he only played 20 minutes and only put up 16 fantasy points. Also for them, Zachary Davis has been really good lately. 3 straight games of 20 fantasy points or more, which we would absolutely take at a salary of $4,700, but that's been because Miles Studi has been out with injury, and Miles Studi is going to be available for this game, so I don't think you can go to the value play that is Zachary Davis. Game number 4 on the slate is Northwestern heading to East Lansing to take on Michigan State. KenPom has this one projected to be 72 to 66 in favor of the Spartans. This is a rematch of a game that was 88 to 74 in favor of Northwestern back earlier in the season. Now, to me, this is a sneaky shootout game because both these teams tend to play at the pace of their opponent. They're more than comfortable slowing it down, but like if the game gets up and down, they'll get up and down, and so their tempo numbers for the season don't rate out pretty good. But they do find themselves in shootouts every now and then. For Northwestern, I'm not even going to look at the previous game's box score because they're running out of players. They lost Ty Berry for the season due to injury. Ryan Langborg has missed the last 3 games. Matthew Nicholson left last game early and may not end up playing this one. If Nicholson does not go, then what I believe you'll see is a lot of minutes for the freshman Luke Hunger, who was a legitimate fantasy option when he started earlier in the season, but just hasn't seen enough minutes since. And I think that Nicholson being out would be a pathway to him seeing a lot of minutes. I think you could also see a lot of Blake Preston off the bench as well. But Hunger at 3K definitely has my interest if Matthew Nicholson is out. And I do believe the Big Ten has mandatory injury reporting, so we should have news on Nicholson to know if we can go to Hunger or Preston as value options. If Langborg continues to be out, then Blake Smith is a really easy click. In the last 2 games, and maybe it was just the last 2 games that Langborg missed. I'll have to double check that. But in the last 2 games, he's put up 13 and 18 fantasy points on 27 and 29 minutes played, which is a pretty solid outcome for a guy who's only 3,500. And he's going to play those minutes. He's going to have opportunities if Langborg is in fact out. Now, after the value plays, like the 3 core guys for Northwestern, Bowie, Barnheiser, and Martinelli, never come off the floor anymore. They've all got to be in consideration for you in cash games, GPPs, whatever format you're going with, because since they're on the floor all the time, one of them is due to have a ceiling game more often than not. And in the last game they played, it was Boo Buie putting up 42 fantasy points against Iowa, but 46 fantasy points against Iowa, excuse me. But before that, Nick Martinelli had a big game against Maryland with 36. So there's just a lot of options here for this Northwestern team where you can pay up for the studs, or you've got the value if we do get Langborg and Nicholson out. On the Michigan State side, I've said time and time again all season long, Malik Hall and Tyson Walker need to be in your player pool if you are playing GPPs because they both have an incredible ceiling. They also have a very low floor. In that game against Northwestern, Malik Hall had a literal floor game because he had -1 fantasy points in 25 minutes. That's just poor. Just all around, it's just poor. It's not likely to happen again, but it's not good. Tyson Walker, on the other hand, had a ceiling game. He had 38 fantasy points in 34 minutes played. So those 2 guys are definitely going to make my player pool, especially at the reduced price tag that we're getting Tyson Walker at. And both of them do have a very legitimate ceiling here in this game. AJ Hoggard had 31 fantasy points in that original meeting, and I tend to like Hoggard and Akins in matchups where we do get a lot of scoring and more pace up games. So I don't think they're bad options considering that the first game featured 162 total points scored. I don't think they're terrible options for that reason. And I do like Xavier Booker a lot. He is a promising freshman for Michigan State who's played 17 and 12 minutes in each of the last 2 games and put up 16 and 14 fantasy points in those 2 games. He is definitely an option in the 3K range as a legitimate value play. Now, before we get into our next game, I do want to mention there are places where you can get more information from me. First off, you can follow me on Twitter at Mike's Money Picks. That is where I will have any updates for the show. So, I mentioned that these live shows are going to be coming. I'm looking to do one Friday night for the Saturday slate. So make sure you follow me on Twitter. That way you can know just when that is occurring and just when our episodes are releasing. And I'm also more than happy to answer any lineup or start sit questions that you may have if you reach out to me on Twitter. I'm also in the Fantasy Corner Discord. Link is in the description on YouTube as well as on the audio feed. Basically, the Fantasy Corner Discord is where we have a lot of smart people who play a lot of DFS for a lot of different sports. And the college basketball chat lately has been jumping. We've had a lot of success, a lot of guys who have won some money there in the Discord. And I'm more than happy to talk plays, lineups, bounce ideas off each other all day long, and then sweat it out together once the slate starts. It's just a blast to be a part of. And if you're looking for a community to be a part of with DFS, I cannot recommend it enough. I am probably not going to have a show for the Thursday night slate for college basketball this week. So if you want my thoughts on the Thursday slate, the Fantasy Corner Discord is where you can get those because I will be in there chatting it up all day long. Also, I do write an article for my Patreon every single college basketball slate where I profile my core plays as well as kind of my lineup strategy and attack strategy for each slate. I can't just sit here and promise that you're going to read those and instantly win GPPs, but I think I provide a lot of good information that a lot of people out there don't provide or don't have, and it can give you a lot of good sound building blocks to start building your lineups and build your own process and help you get better at college basketball at the DFS. All right, so with that being said, let's go ahead and dive into game number 5, which is Houston heading to Orlando to take on UCF. KenPom has this one projected to be Houston 70-60 for a 130-point total. The previous meeting between these two teams was 57-42 in favor of Houston for a 99-point total. So 99 points in the first meeting. You can just you can avoid this one if you want to. I will mention, though, Jamal Shed in that first meeting, even with the extremely low total, was still pretty darn successful. He had 35 fantasy points in that game, which is not bad. Only got off 11 shots, which he's been doing pretty much on a routine basis lately. I don't think he's a terrible option at $8,700 in this game environment, but I don't think he's the best option on the slate either. But if this game were to shoot out, or if Houston were to get to 80, it'd probably be because of Jamal Shed scoring and assisting on a lot of buckets. Now, Joseph Tugwart is out for the foreseeable future. He did miss Saturday's game, so we have a one-game sample size to kind of go off of and see, what they do with their lineups, or, what they do with their usage. And what it appears to be on Saturday was a big boost for Juwan Roberts, who, is going to get more minutes at the 5 spot now as opposed to playing the 4. And so in that game against Oklahoma, he was 10 for 12 from the field, 33 fantasy points. I could totally see that trend continuing here this one with him continuing to play the 5. Against UCF, he struggled a bit, only played 18 minutes, only put up 15 fantasy points, but they can't afford to only play him 18 minutes if Joseph Tugwart is going to be out. I do think he does have some legitimate upside at 7,500. Now, another thing that's interesting, Xavier Francis will probably see more minutes with Tugwart out, but what they didn't really give minutes to any of the other bigs, a whole lot at least. Connor Lath did play a little bit. Cedric Lath. Why do I want to call him Connor? He played a little bit in that last game, but not much to be fantasy viable. Malik Wilson played much more off the bench, though. They kind of had him in this super, super small ball role against Oklahoma, where he was like playing the 4 as like a 6'3" guard. He played 25 minutes and put up 21 fantasy points. I don't know if he's necessarily going to do that again, but it's just something to monitor going forward. Do they bring a new big into the fold like Lath? Do they play a smaller lineup? Does Roberts play more of the 5? It's just something to be interested in going forward to see what Houston does with the Tugwart injury. UCF, why? They're going up against Houston. They scored 42 points last time. You don't have to play anybody from UCF, so don't. If you did, Marcellus Avery was the guy who led them in fantasy scoring last time against Houston. Care to guess how many fantasy points he scored? 20. Nobody on their team had more than 20 fantasy points in the first matchup against Houston. If that didn't talk you into playing nobody from UCF, I don't know what will. Darius Johnson's usage rate lately has been pretty darn incredible, though. So if anybody were to get there, if anybody were to, get through the cracks of this Houston defense, of which there are not many, it would be Darius Johnson, and he would probably be the one guy I would be willing to take a shot with. Next up, we have TCU heading to Morgantown to take on West Virginia. KenPom has this one projected to be 79-72 in favor of TCU. The previous meeting this season was 81-65 in favor of TCU, and what you saw in that game was a Jameer Nelson Jr. ceiling game with 36 fantasy points, and it should come as no shocker because we talked about this West Virginia team time and time again. They are a very poor defensive backcourt, so scoring guards and distributing guards are going to have opportunities to put up a ton of fantasy points against them. In that first meeting, it was Jameer Nelson. What's interesting kind of to monitor moving forward, though, is Avery Anderson has moved into the starting lineup as opposed to Travion Tennyson. He's played slightly more minutes than he used to, but not like a whole lot more. In that first game against West Virginia, he only played 21 minutes, was 0 for 5 from the field, only put up 10 fantasy points. But if he's going to be out there for 28, 29 minutes, which he has been for more than often than not the last few games, he's definitely an option at $5,800 because this West Virginia backcourt is so bad defensively. Now, on the West Virginia side, they really – one more thing with TCU. Ernest Uday is still injured. I don't know if he's going to play in this game or not. There's very little information available for it. But Mustafa and Coles have just not been the click and hit 5X guys that they were at the start of that Ernest Uday injury. But those are the two guys that are going to be playing a lot of minutes with a little bit of support from Xavier as well. On the West Virginia side, In that first game, they really just kind of let Raekwon battle Chuck, which is what he does. In that game against TCU, he did come away with 17 shots and 34 fantasy points, which is not bad. If he continues to shoot that many times, he's going to score a lot of fantasy points. Jesse Edwards dealt with foul trouble in that game, which has me concerned, to play in this rematch because it's been his worst game in all conference play. And the fact that he dealt with foul trouble, he doesn't often deal with foul trouble. So, not exactly the best spot for Jesse Edwards, in my opinion. One guy I do like for West Virginia is Kobe Johnson as a value play. Look, he just plays a ton of minutes and sees enough shots and gets you enough peripheral stats that in a game that gets up and down, if he plays enough minutes, he's going to score enough fantasy points to get to 4x value. Also worth noting for West Virginia is they did start Josiah Harris over Quinn Slazinski in their last game, but I don't know if it didn't work or just, maybe they just still have loyalty to Slazinski or whatever, but he started in that game against Texas Tech, but Josiah Harris did, but he only played 13 minutes, only put up 8 fantasy points. Quinn Slazinski still played a majority of the minutes. He still played 27 minutes and put up 22 minutes. So just know that this team is willing to tinker with their starting lineup, and that's something to monitor moving forward. Next up, we have a game that I do like quite a lot. That is Boston College heading to Coral Gables to take on Miami. In this game, KenPom has it projected to be 80 to 75 in favor of the Hurricanes. And in the previous meeting between these two teams, Boston College won 85 to 77. The one thing I would caution you with is that KenPom total, KenPom doesn't know all the injuries Miami has. More on that in a second. For Boston College, in that game, we had a clash of the Titans between two good college basketball big men in Quentin Post of Boston College and Norchad Omier of Miami. Quentin Post played 35 minutes and put up 37 fantasy points. That's just kind of what he does, right? Each of the last 2 games, he's been over 47 fantasy points. He is their usage leader on the season. He is a very versatile big fella for Boston College, and as long as he can stay out of foul trouble on Norchad Omier, he has the potential to have a huge performance like he did the first time. We also saw ceiling performances from Mason Madsen, who put up 38 fantasy points in 34 minutes, as well as Claudel Harris, who put up 35 fantasy points in 30 minutes in that first game against Miami. The good news is with Boston College is they have been pretty much really loyal to their starting 5. Post, Zachary, Madsen, McLaughlin, and Harris are playing all the minutes, and I think those are the guys that you want to stick with as fantasy options here for this team. On the Miami side, like I said, they have injuries galore right now. They played their last game without Wooga Poplar and Nigel Pack, and what that did was that has given a huge boost to Bensley Joseph. But DraftKings decided to give him a huge boost in price tag. 3 of the last 4 games, he's been 31 fantasy points or higher, which is pretty good, even at the salary that they put him at. But I don't know, I kind of miss the days of playing him at like 5,700 instead of 7,700. So that price tag does have me a little bit spooked on Bensley Joseph, even though we know he's going to get a ton of minutes and a ton of usage. Norchad Omier also has seen his usage go up with the absence of other players. Now, his efficiency isn't always there. Against Boston College, he was pretty darn efficient, 8 for 13 from the field with that 36 fantasy point performance. After that, Cleveland and George are healthy. They're going to play a ton of minutes. They're kind of boom or bust guys. You never really know what you're going to get for them. And in the last game, Christian Watson started at guard in place of Wooga Poplar. Played 26 minutes, only put 8 fantasy points, but he's 3,300, and if he plays 25 minutes again, I can kind of make an argument for playing him in this game environment that's projected to have 155 points scored. All right, let's take a quick little breather, and then let's wrap it up with our last 3 games of the night. All right, we are entering the home stretch here. Got 3 games to go. 2 of them are going to be battles in the Big East. The first one is going to be Xavier heading to Indianapolis to Hinkle Fieldhouse to take on Butler. KenPom has this one projected to be Butler 79 to 77. This is one of the better game environments of the night, in my opinion. To me, this is a game that sets up as a close game. We know that both these teams like to get up and down, and as the season has gone on and both these teams are, finding themselves probably on the outside looking in of the bubble of the NCAA tournament, they're going to be running their starters more minutes. They're going to be trying to squeeze every ounce that they can out of their best players. So that makes them a lot easier to target from DFS purposes. So the original meeting between these two teams was an 85 to 71 Xavier victory. And we've talked all season long about Xavier's big 3 guards, Quincy Olivari, Davion McKnight, and Desmond Claude. And Desmond Claude is the cheapest of the 3 of them right now. And he's the guy that I want to play the most because in that first game against Xavier, he was outstanding. He was able to put up, hold on, I got to find it in the game log here. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm looking for the wrong game. I was looking for Butler. And he plays for Xavier. So I mixed it up again. Anyway, Desmond Claude in that first meeting put up 37 fantasy points on 9 for 19 shooting. He led them in shots, he led them in usage, and he led them in fantasy scoring with 37 fantasy points in that game. He is also coming off of a 48 fantasy point performance against Georgetown, where he again led all three of those guards in shots and usage. So Claude, for me, is the guy I want, and he's $2,500 on DraftKings, cheaper than Quincy Olivari. So I think he is the best option at the guard spot among those three. Now, also interesting for Xavier is that they have moved Kachi Nze into the starting lineup. Sean Miller's been pretty vocal about how he's not satisfied with his bigs and he wants more out of them. Well, Nze has started each of the last two games, played 22 and 28 minutes, and put up 7 and 24 fantasy points. So you have one kind of dud and one really good fantasy performance. What's this one going to be? I don't know, but he's in a great game environment, and it only costs $4,200 to find out. And this is not injury dependent. I think he is legitimately one of the better value plays on the slate at the forward position, because I don't see any signs of Sean Miller changing it up again and moving Gaitis Namicha back into the starting lineup. Now, on the Butler side, they scored a lot of fantasy points in that first meeting, even though they only put up 71 real points. Posh Alexander in that game had 43 fantasy points, and Pierre Brooks had 33. So Posh Alexander is kind of the straw that stirs the drink for Butler, and we've seen that all season long. He was able to fill up the stat sheet for 21, 4, and 5 with 4 steals in that first game against Xavier. That's just what he does. Had a little bit of a dud against DePaul on Saturday, but that's okay. That's DePaul. That's a game where he wasn't really needed to do a whole lot. In this game against Xavier, with their NCAA tournament lives on the line, I look for them to use the veteran guard to his fullest and him to play a ton of minutes, have a ton of usage, have a ton of opportunities to put up fantasy points. Pierre Brooks is a guy that I'm interested in. I'm also interested in DJ Davis, because Xavier really struggles against catch and shoot three-point shooters. For whatever reason, that's the shots that they tend to give up are catch and shoot threes. If you watch a Xavier game, which I have this season, that's what they give up a lot of. And Pierre Brooks is a guy who will shoot catch and shoot threes. He was 5 for 9 from downtown against Xavier in 37 minutes, scored 33 fantasy points in that game, as we previously mentioned. So him and DJ Davis are both on my radar for this one. I also really like Jalen Thomas. We have seen bigs just completely batter Xavier on the inside. And in the first meeting between these two teams, Jalen Thomas only played 23 minutes, but he only needed 23 minutes to put up 34 fantasy points. He had a double-double in 23 minutes. That's really hard to do. And so if he can maintain that same level of efficiency and maybe play 30 minutes as opposed to 23, that's a recipe for a ceiling performance from Jalen Thomas, and I really like that possibility. If you want to strategically fade Thomas, Andre Screen is his backup, and Andre Screen came in on Saturday against DePaul, played 12 minutes, put up 21 fantasy points. So he is also capable of scoring fantasy points in bunches at an incredibly high fantasy point per minute rate. Speaking of incredibly high fantasy point per minute rates, Donovan Clingan. So the next game is going to be UConn heading to Milwaukee to take on Marquette. KenPom has this one projected to be 76 to 74 in favor of the Huskies. However, KenPom does not know the injuries that Marquette is dealing with. And plus, in the original meeting between these two teams, UConn won 81 to 53 in an utter rout. In that first meeting, Tristan Newton had 41 fantasy points and Donovan Clingan had 40. And look, at this point, we know what these two guys are. Tristan Newton is Mr. Triple-Double, who, if the game stays reasonably close and he plays a full minute load, is a legitimate threat to put up a triple-double. And you got to like him on any slate he's on, even at this inflated price tag of $9,600. My only concern would be this being a blowout and him only getting to play 25 minutes. Donovan Clingan's kind of in the same boat. He's an incredibly good point-per-minute player from a fantasy perspective. Against Marquette, he only played 24 minutes and put up 40 fantasy points. But he does need all 24 of those minutes to put up 40 fantasy points, right? Like, if this game were to turn into a blowout and him only to play like 17 minutes like he did against DePaul, he only put up 26 fantasy points in that game. So we need this game to be reasonably close so that he stays out there. And if he does stay out there for his normal minute load, he does have legitimate 45 fantasy point upside at a salary of $8,100. Now, Hassan Diarra is the value that I will consider from UConn. He is kind of the blowout king for them, so I probably wouldn't necessarily stack him with Clingan or Newton, but in blowouts, he plays a ton of minutes, scores a lot of fantasy points. I mean, just look at the game log and it bears that out. Against Marquette, the first time, he played 27 minutes and put up 35 fantasy points right after playing 21 minutes against DePaul and putting up 25 fantasy points. I really like that combination for Diarra if this game does turn into a blowout. Now, why might it turn into a blowout? Well, Marquette might be without their two best players. Tyler Kolek has already been declared out for this game, and Oso Ighodaro is questionable. If Ighodaro misses, Ben Gold will slide into the starting lineup like he did on Saturday against Creighton. He played 36 minutes in that game and put up 16 fantasy points, which is not bad. If Ighodaro is out, Ben Gold is a very legitimate value play at 4,600. Now, with Kolek being out, Chase Ross moved into the starting lineup, but he was really just a point guard in name only played 23 minutes, only took 3 shots, only put up 4 fantasy points. The guy you want at the guard spot is Stevie Mitchell. He was the one who really ran the point, played 32 minutes, put up 29 fantasy points in that game, 7 for 13 from the field. He is the guy that I would consider the biggest beneficiary of Tyler Kolek being out. Trey Norman and Zayd Lowry are going to play minutes also, but they didn't really have sizable roles in the offense on Saturday with Kolek out. So I would be much more trusting in Stevie Mitchell than any of the other guards. And Cam Jones is going to get his. He's going to take a ton of shots. Whether or not they go in is, totally you don't know what's going to happen. The last time against UConn, he only put up 24 fantasy points. I also do really like David Joplin. He can be kind of the forgotten guy in this Marquette offense, but he actually led them in usage in that game against Creighton, was 8 for 13 from the field, put up 30 fantasy points. I think that's a really solid spot for David Joplin. If Kolek and Ighodaro out, Jones and Joplin are really the only guys left that are going to be able to generate their own shots and generate offense. And so I think Joplin is definitely going to get a lot of consideration for me if we get Kolek and Ighodaro both out. The last game of the night is between BYU and Iowa State, and y'all, these are two teams I don't play a whole lot of guys from, and I'll explain. KenPom has this one projected to be 76-71 in favor of the Cyclones. This is a rematch of a meeting earlier this season that was won 87-72 by BYU. Now, BYU in that game got a ceiling game from Spencer Johnson. The guy is like 30. He's a savvy veteran, and every now and then he has these ceiling games. Against Iowa State, he played 35 minutes, and put up 50 fantasy points, which was his high for the season. Now, why I normally don't play guys from BYU is because they're normally really deep, and they normally play a ton of guys, and a ton of guys are going to take shots. In that first meeting, there was no Fousseyni Traore, and there was no Trevin Knell, so there was more minutes and more shots to go around that allowed Spencer Johnson to hit his ceiling. However, what I will say this time about Spencer Johnson, though, is that he is a very reasonable price tag at only $5,200. This is a guy who's likely to play north of 30 minutes, likely to take between 7 and 10 shots, will get you some rebounds and assists. $5,200, I think he is a great cash game option because I think about 18 fantasy points is his floor. I just don't think it's necessarily likely that he has a ceiling game against the tough Iowa State defense and with all the other BYU mouths to feed. Now, one mouth that doesn't take long to feed is Fousseyni Traore. I mentioned that he missed that previous game against Iowa State. Well, he's been kind of in and out of the lineup with injuries this year, but when he's been in it, he doesn't need a whole lot of minutes to score a whole lot of fantasy points. He's one of the best fantasy point per minute players in all of college basketball. And if you need evidence of that, just go back and look at the game log, right? He routinely averages about 1.5 points per minute from a fantasy perspective. Against TCU, he only needed 23 minutes to put up 33 fantasy points. That's pretty incredible. And at $6,200, who's to say that he won't just randomly get 25 minutes and put up 40 fantasy points? It's certainly within the realm of possibility. And I always like Fousseyni Traore anytime he is on a slate, but the rest of the BYU team is really tough to target. Ali Khalifa is not a bad option. He went to my school, Charlotte, previously, and they called him the Egyptian Jokic. Every now and then he'll have these games where he just absolutely cooks, and then he'll disappear for a little bit. So if you're playing GPPs, $4,700 is a very reasonable price tag to pay for him. On the Iowa State side, they're another team that they just play these slow, sloggy games all the time, and they don't really put up a lot of fantasy points because no one really has a super high assist rate on the team. The rebounds are spread out. They play a decent amount of guys. It's just not a great fantasy scoring environment. What I will say, though, is we talked all season long about their two guards, Gilbert and Lipsey. Gilbert was better in the original meeting against BYU. In that game, he was able to put up only 22 fantasy points, and he was the better of the two. And he's kind of been the better guard as we get down the stretch of the season in terms of usage and in terms of fantasy production. So if I were to play one between Gilbert and Lipsey, it would certainly be Gilbert. Curtis Jones is an interesting pivot. He's a transfer from Buffalo who can get you some buckets. And he's been taking just as many shots recently as Lipsey and Gilbert, but he's much cheaper on DraftKings, so I think he's worth consideration for that reason. Trey King is the big of all bigs that on Iowa State that I would prefer. He generally gets the most usage, generally gets the most shots. That bared itself out against UCF, where he played 27 minutes and put up 26 fantasy points. All right, so that does it for the Wednesday. March 6th slate of college basketball at DFS. If you like what you saw here in this video, go ahead and hit that like button on YouTube. Go ahead and rate and review the audio. It really does help me out a ton, and I really do appreciate it. You guys are the absolute best. And while you're at it, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. That way you can be with us for the rest of college basketball season. Reminder, if you want more from me, you can follow me on Twitter at Mike's Money Picks. Join the Fantasy Corner Discord so we can chop it up in there and talk about picks and plays. And then I do have a full article on the Patreon if you are interested in getting that help as well. So that pretty much does it for this episode, guys. Hopefully I was able to give you plenty of information that is going to allow you to build a winning lineup for this Wednesday night slate. And like I said, I'm probably not going to be here for the Thursday night slate. I do want to be back for the Friday night slate because I do think there's some interesting games on that are going to be on that slate. But anyway, make sure you subscribe to the channel so that way you will know when our new episodes drop. And I am planning on going live Friday night for the Saturday slate. So if you follow me on Twitter, you're subscribed to the channel, you'll know when that is going to happen. All right, so that does it for this episode, guys. If you've watched and listened to this point, thank you guys for listening. Best of luck to you on the Wednesday slate, and I will see you next time.